It was a calm, peaceful evening as Amara Johnson drove home after a long day of business meetings. Amara wasn't just any woman. She was a millionaire, a successful entrepreneur who had built her empire from the ground up. She owned several businesses and had earned every bit of her wealth. But despite her success, she never let it change who she was. She remained grounded, always polite and humble. The streets were quiet, and Amara loved how the city looked at night, with streetlights glowing softly as they lit up the road. She drove her sleek black car, the sound of the engine humming smoothly. As she passed through neighborhoods she knew well, she thought about the meeting she had earlier. Things were looking good. Her company was expanding, and life was moving forward in the right direction. But little did Amara know, tonight would be anything but ordinary. As she stopped at a red light, a police car suddenly pulled in behind her. She glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the flashing lights. At first, she thought it might just be a routine check, like the kind you see on the news when police stop people to check if they're driving safely. Amara wasn't nervous. She knew she hadn't done anything wrong. She was simply tired from her day and eager to get home. The police car stayed right behind her, the lights still flashing. Amara turned on her blinker and slowly pulled over to the side of the road, keeping her hands visible on the steering wheel, just as she had been taught. She had always heard that staying calm and following the officer's instructions was the best way to handle these situations. The officer stepped out of his car and walked toward Amara's window. She rolled it down, ready to greet him with a polite smile. He looked to be in his mid-30s, wearing a typical police uniform. But there was something about his expression that made Amara feel uneasy. His face was tense, like he was looking for trouble. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" the officer asked, his voice sharp and cold. Amara blinked in surprise. "No, officer. I don't think I was speeding or anything." The officer narrowed his eyes, glancing at her car. "You didn't signal when you turned back there. That's a violation of traffic laws." Amara's brow furrowed slightly. She knew she had signaled properly. But rather than argue, she simply nodded. "I'm sorry if I missed that, officer. I was just following the flow of traffic." The officer didn't seem to care much about her explanation. Without another word, he asked her to step out of the car. This caught Amara off guard. She had always thought that a simple traffic stop was just a warning, but the officer's tone was serious, even harsh. She didn't want to cause any trouble, so she did as he asked and unbuckled her seatbelt. As soon as she stepped out of the car, the officer's demeanor shifted. He wasn't just talking to her anymore. He was starting to order her around in a way that made her feel uncomfortable. He told her to stand by the side of the road and started asking questions that didn't make much sense. Why was he being so aggressive? Amara couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She had no idea what was about to happen next. Amara stood on the side of the road, still unsure of what was happening. The officer wasn't talking to her like she was just another person being pulled over for a small mistake. His eyes seemed cold and distant, as if he wasn't seeing her for who she was, just a woman on her way home. Instead, he was treating her like she was a criminal. She tried to stay calm. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked politely, hoping that things wouldn't escalate. The officer didn't answer right away. He was looking at her as if he was waiting for her to say something wrong. Then he suddenly gestured toward her car. "Step over here. I need to search your vehicle," he said, his voice flat, almost commanding. Amara froze for a moment, searching her car. She had done nothing wrong. There was no reason for him to search her vehicle. She had always been respectful toward law enforcement, so why was he acting like this? "I haven't done anything wrong, officer. Why do you need to search my car?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. She was getting confused now. The situation was taking a strange turn, and she wasn't sure how to handle it. The officer didn't seem to care about her concerns. Instead, he grew even more impatient. "Just move it now," he snapped, pointing toward her car. "I don't have time for questions." Amara's mind raced. Was this really happening? Was this officer really treating her like a criminal over a simple mistake? She could feel her heart beating faster as she realized she had no idea how to get out of this situation. She glanced around, hoping that maybe someone would come to help her. But the streets were quiet, and no one seemed to be around. The officer seemed to sense her hesitation and took a step closer, almost pushing her toward her car. "Let's go now," he repeated, his voice harsh. Amara didn't know what to do. She had no choice but to follow his commands. She didn't want to cause trouble, but she also didn't want to let him get away with treating her this way. She took a deep breath and stepped toward her car, her hands still visible. As she reached for the door handle, the officer reached out and grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the car. Amara gasped in shock. "What are you doing?" she cried, trying to pull back. "Get out of the car," he barked, his grip tightening. Amara's mind went into overdrive. What was going on? Why was he treating her like this? She didn't know what had triggered this officer's anger, but everything in her told her that something wasn't right. She had done nothing to deserve this treatment. The officer didn't seem to care about her confusion or concern. With no warning, he began dragging her away from her car, his hands rough as he pulled her toward the sidewalk. It was all happening so quickly, and Amara had no idea how to stop it. The more she resisted, the angrier the officer seemed to get. She felt a wave of frustration and fear wash over her. Why was this happening? Why was he treating her this way, as if she were the problem? Her heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. She couldn't let him see how scared she was. The officer wasn't letting go, and Amara had no choice but to go along with what was happening. But in the back of her mind, she was already thinking about what she would do next. She wasn't going to let him get away with this. She wouldn't stand by and let him walk all over her. Amara's heart raced as the officer dragged her further away from her car. Her mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what was happening. Nothing about this situation felt normal. She had never been treated this way before, especially not by someone in uniform. She had always respected the police, but now she was starting to feel like she was just another target. As the officer pulled her onto the sidewalk, Amara's mind raced with questions. Why was he being so aggressive? Why was he treating her like a criminal when she had done nothing wrong? She tried to think back to the moment when he first stopped her, but everything seemed to blur together. The red lights flashing in her rearview mirror, the harsh tone of his voice. It all felt unreal. "Stop resisting," the officer barked, his grip tightening on her arm. Amara froze. She wasn't resisting. She was simply trying to understand what was happening. She was trying to stay calm and respectful, but the officer wasn't making it easy. His words felt like an accusation, and the way he spoke to her made it clear he wasn't going to listen to reason. "I'm not resisting," she said, her voice firm but still calm. "I just don't understand why you're doing this." The officer didn't respond. Instead, he pushed her roughly to the ground. Amara's knees hit the pavement, and a sharp pain shot up her legs. She winced but quickly pushed herself back up, refusing to let him see her weakness. "Get up," he ordered, his voice cold. Amara stood up slowly, trying to keep her balance. The pain in her knees throbbed, but she refused to let it stop her. She wasn't going to give in to his intimidation. She looked around, hoping someone would step in. But the street was still quiet, and the only sound she could hear was the officer's harsh breathing. The other cars that had passed earlier were nowhere to be seen, leaving her feeling more isolated than ever. "What do you think you're doing?" she asked, trying to keep the fear from creeping into her voice. The officer didn't answer. Instead, he pulled out his radio and began speaking into it. Amara couldn't hear everything he was saying, but the tone of his voice sounded like he was calling for backup. This only made her more nervous. What was he planning to do next? Amara's mind raced. She had heard stories of people being mistreated by officers in situations like this, but she never thought it would happen to her. She had done nothing wrong. She was just trying to get home after a long day of work. "Why are you doing this?" she asked again, her voice shaking slightly. This time, the officer turned to her, his eyes filled with anger. "I said, stop asking questions," he snapped. Amara swallowed hard, trying to control her breathing. She couldn't let him see how afraid she was. She had worked too hard to get where she was to let someone treat her like this. She wasn't going to back down. But just as she thought the situation couldn't get any worse, something unexpected happened. The sound of a car engine revved in the distance, followed by the screeching of tires. Amara looked up to see another police car pulling up to the scene. This new officer quickly got out and rushed toward her. At first, Amara felt a wave of panic. Was this officer going to be just as aggressive? But as the new officer approached, she saw something different in his expression. He wasn't angry. In fact, he looked concerned. "What's going on here?" the new officer asked, his voice calm and steady. The first officer didn't respond right away. Instead, he just stood there, holding Amara's arm tightly. It was as if he didn't want to admit that he had made a mistake. But the second officer wasn't having it. "Let her go," he ordered, his voice firm. Amara's heart skipped a beat. Could it be? Was someone finally standing up for her? Amara's breath caught in her chest as she watched the new officer approach. For a moment, she wasn't sure if this officer was going to help her or make things worse. The first officer still had a tight grip on her arm, but the second officer's calm demeanor gave Amara a spark of hope. Could he be here to stop what was happening? The new officer looked at the first one, his eyes narrowing. "Let her go," he repeated, his tone firm, but not angry. There was something protective in his voice, and it made Amara feel like she might not be alone in this fight. For a few long seconds, the first officer hesitated. His grip on Amara's arm was still tight, but his eyes flickered to the new officer. Finally, with a sharp exhale, he released his hold on her. Amara stepped back, rubbing her sore arm where the first officer had gripped her. She didn't take her eyes off the two officers, her heart still pounding in her chest. She had no idea what was going to happen next, but she was starting to feel like maybe, just maybe, the situation might turn in her favor. The new officer turned to her, his expression softening. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. Amara nodded quickly, still processing what had just happened. She didn't speak right away. She wasn't sure what to say. Her mind was swirling with anger, confusion, and disbelief. She had just been dragged from her car for no reason, and now she was standing on the side of the road, trying to make sense of it all. But as she looked around, she noticed something that made her feel even more unsettled. People had begun to gather on the sidewalk, drawn by the commotion. A small crowd had formed, and several people were holding up their phones, recording the scene. Amara wasn't sure how she felt about being filmed, but in a way, it made her feel like she wasn't alone anymore. People were watching. They were seeing the injustice that was happening in real time. One man, who looked to be in his 20s, spoke up from the crowd. "What's going on here? Why is she being treated like this?" His voice was loud enough for everyone to hear, and it made Amara's heart swell with relief. Someone was finally speaking up. Another woman, holding her phone up, shouted, "This is crazy. What did she do?" "Nothing." Amara turned toward the new officer, feeling a bit more confident now that others were joining in. "You saw what just happened, right? Why was I dragged out of my car like that?" The new officer gave her a nod, his eyes sympathetic. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," he said. "Let's get this sorted out." Meanwhile, the first officer, who had been quiet up until this point, stood there with his arms crossed. His face was hard to read, but the tension in his body was clear. He didn't seem to know what to do with the growing crowd around him, and it was obvious that the situation was slipping out of his control. One of the bystanders, a man with a deep voice, called out again, "You're not above the law. You can't just treat people like this for no reason." Amara could feel the pressure building. The crowd was getting louder, and the attention was shifting away from her and onto the officer. The new officer glanced at the first officer, who was now visibly uncomfortable under the scrutiny of the onlookers. "Let's get things under control," the new officer said, stepping in front of Amara. "I'm going to speak to you, but I need you to cooperate." The first officer didn't say anything in response. Instead, he seemed to be retreating, stepping back from the scene. The crowd murmured, some people still recording, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Amara could hardly believe what was happening. The first officer had been so sure of himself, so confident in his actions. But now he was retreating, his authority crumbling in front of the growing crowd. It felt like a small victory, even though the situation wasn't fully over. Amara knew that things were changing. The crowd's reaction, the new officer's support, it was all shifting the balance in her favor. The injustice she had faced was being witnessed, and it felt like justice was finally on its way. Amara stood there, still trying to process what had just happened. The first officer was slowly stepping back, his face a mixture of anger and embarrassment. The new officer had positioned himself between her and the first officer, keeping a calm but firm presence. The crowd's murmurs were growing louder as people continued recording, and Amara could feel the weight of their attention on her. She didn't know what to do next. The situation was still unresolved, and she wasn't sure what would happen now. What if the first officer decided to cause more trouble? What if he still tried to arrest her for something she didn't do? Her thoughts were interrupted by the buzzing of her phone in her pocket. It was a quick reminder that she wasn't alone in this fight. She fumbled for her phone and pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was her lawyer, Sarah Davis. Amara didn't hesitate. She quickly pressed the green button to answer. "Hello." Amara's voice trembled slightly, but she was determined to stay calm. "Amara, what's going on? I just saw the video. I'm on my way to the scene, but I need you to stay calm and not say anything more to that officer. We're going to handle this, okay?" Sarah's voice was calm and steady, offering Amara some reassurance. Amara nodded, even though she knew Sarah couldn't see her. "I'm trying to stay calm, but this officer is treating me like a criminal. I didn't do anything wrong. He just dragged me out of my car for no reason." "I know, I saw the footage," Sarah replied. "And we'll make sure this officer faces the consequences. But you need to keep your cool. Don't engage any further unless absolutely necessary. I'll be there soon." Amara took a deep breath. The sound of Sarah's voice made her feel a little bit stronger. At least someone on the outside was fighting for her. She could feel the tension in her body starting to ease, knowing that things were starting to turn in her favor. "I understand," Amara said. "But I'm scared, Sarah. I don't know what he's going to do next. What if he arrests me for something I didn't do?" "Amara, listen to me. We have the footage. We have the witnesses. You're not alone in this," Sarah reassured her. "That officer is in the wrong here, and you're not going to be left to deal with this by yourself." Amara felt a wave of relief wash over her. For the first time since the officer had pulled her over, she felt like maybe everything would be okay. She wasn't just a victim of the situation. She had people on her side, and together, they would make sure the truth came out. "I'll be there soon, all right," Sarah said, her voice full of confidence. "Stay strong. We got this." Before Amara could say anything more, she heard the sound of a car pulling up behind her. She looked up and saw Sarah's familiar black sedan coming to a stop. Sarah stepped out of the car quickly, her heels clicking on the pavement as she made her way toward Amara. The crowd had started to calm down, but there were still plenty of people watching. Amara felt a small sense of comfort seeing Sarah approaching. She had always admired her lawyer's calm confidence in tough situations. Sarah had a way of handling things with grace, and Amara was starting to feel like she wasn't facing this battle alone. The new officer, who had been watching from a distance, nodded at Sarah as she arrived. "She's with me," he said to the first officer, who was still standing a few feet away. Without another word, Sarah walked over to Amara, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's going to be all right," Sarah said quietly, giving her a look that was both kind and determined. Amara finally allowed herself to breathe a little easier. She wasn't sure how everything would unfold, but with Sarah by her side, she felt like there was a chance to make things right. Sarah's arrival brought a sense of calm to the situation. The first officer, still standing a few feet away, seemed hesitant now. He had lost some of his earlier confidence, especially with the new officer keeping a close eye on him. The crowd, which had been growing, started murmuring even more. They were witnessing a real shift, and Amara could feel the energy in the air. Sarah didn't waste any time. She turned to the new officer first. "What's the situation here?" she asked, her voice steady and professional. The new officer glanced at the first officer, then back at Sarah. This officer stopped her for a minor traffic violation, but things escalated quickly. He pulled her out of the car without explanation and began dragging her onto the sidewalk. Amara watched as Sarah listened carefully. She had worked with Sarah for years, and seeing her in action always reassured Amara. Sarah wasn't just a lawyer. She was someone who would fight with everything. She had to make sure justice was done. "And the crowd?" Sarah asked, her eyes scanning the people who were still recording the scene. "They're witnessing the whole thing," the new officer replied. "Some of them are pretty upset about what they saw." Sarah turned to face Amara. "I'm going to take care of this, I promise. Just stay calm. The witnesses are on your side, and we're going to make sure this officer's actions are investigated thoroughly." Amara nodded, feeling a bit of hope. She had heard the stories of people being mistreated by police officers before, but she had never imagined it would happen to her. Still, with Sarah's support and the witnesses around her, she felt like there was a chance to make things right. Just as Sarah was about to speak to the first officer, her phone buzzed. She pulled it out of her pocket and glanced at the screen. Amara could tell it was important. Sarah's face went serious as she read the message. "What's going on?" Amara asked, curious. "It's from the district attorney's office," Sarah replied, her voice a little more tense. "They've already seen the footage. They're moving fast on this one. We're not going to wait for this to drag on." Amara felt a wave of relief. If the district attorney's office was already involved, it meant that things were moving quickly. This wasn't just a random traffic stop anymore. This was a clear case of abuse of power, and Amara wasn't going to let it slide. The first officer, who had been standing quietly, finally spoke up. "I'm going to file a report," he said, his voice stiff. "But I'm telling you, this isn't over." Sarah's eyes narrowed as she looked at him. "You're right. It's far from over. And don't think we won't be looking into your actions. I'll make sure this investigation is thorough. You'll be held accountable for what happened here today." The officer shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. He was clearly not used to being challenged like this. The crowd around them seemed to sense the shift as well, with people nodding and whispering their approval of Sarah's words. Amara couldn't help but feel a small sense of triumph. She wasn't the only one speaking out. The crowd, Sarah, and the witnesses had all come together, and it was clear that the officer's actions were under scrutiny now. As Sarah continued to speak with the officer, Amara looked around at the people who had gathered. She saw the same faces that had been recording the scene. They were still watching, still waiting to see what would happen next. And for the first time since the incident had started, Amara felt like she had some control over the situation. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was part of something bigger, something that was going to make a difference. Amara stood on the sidewalk, her hands clenched at her sides, as she watched the scene unfold. The tension in the air was thick, but she could feel a sense of change. Sarah was speaking with the first officer, who was now clearly on edge. His earlier confidence had all but disappeared. The crowd was still watching, their phones raised, recording every moment. It was no longer just about Amara. It had become about justice, and everyone seemed to know it. Amara felt a mix of emotions: anger, confusion, but above all, she felt something else: strength. Strength that came from knowing she wasn't facing this alone. With Sarah by her side, and the support of the crowd and the witnesses, Amara felt like she might finally have a chance to right this wrong. The first officer was growing more agitated. He kept glancing at Sarah, his movements quick and stiff. His eyes darted around, avoiding direct contact with her. It was clear that he wasn't used to being questioned, especially in front of a crowd. Sarah stood her ground, not backing down. "You're going to have to explain yourself," she said firmly. "Your actions today were uncalled for. You can't treat someone like this and expect no consequences." The first officer swallowed hard, clearly uncomfortable under her steady gaze. He turned toward the new officer, who had been silently observing the situation. "I'm going to have to file a report," the first officer muttered, almost to himself. But he still hadn't made a move. Amara's heart raced. She knew that the officer had acted wrongly, but would there be any real consequences for him? Would anyone take her side and help her make sure that he was held accountable? Just as she was starting to feel doubt creeping in, she saw a new set of police cars pulling up to the scene. 2 more officers stepped out, their uniforms crisp and professional. One of them looked directly at Sarah, and Sarah gave him a nod. The first officer seemed to stiffen at the sight of the new arrivals. He exchanged a quick glance with the second officer, who hadn't said much. The crowd grew quieter, all eyes on the officers as the situation started to shift even more in Amara's favor. The new officer stepped forward and addressed the first officer. "What's going on here?" he asked calmly, but there was a firmness in his voice that made it clear he wasn't going to tolerate any nonsense. The first officer hesitated before responding. "I pulled her over for a minor traffic violation. It escalated when she started resisting. I had to take action." The new officer didn't look convinced. "Resisting? I've seen the footage. That's not what happened. You handled this situation poorly, and you're putting yourself in a position where you'll be investigated." Amara's heart skipped a beat. The words she had been waiting for were finally coming to life. The officer was being held accountable for his actions, and it seemed like the wheels of justice were starting to turn. The first officer's face reddened as he tried to defend himself, but the new officer wasn't having it. He signaled for one of the other officers to move forward. "You're under arrest," he said, his voice clear and unwavering. "For misconduct, abuse of power, and for what we now know was an unnecessary escalation of a simple traffic stop." Amara couldn't believe her ears. The officer who had treated her like a criminal was now being arrested himself. The crowd seemed to hold its breath as the officer was handcuffed and led toward one of the police cars. It was a sight Amara would never forget. The officer who had tried to control her was now being controlled himself. As the first officer was driven away, Amara stood there, processing everything. The adrenaline still surged through her body, but now there was a sense of relief. For the first time since the incident began, she felt like justice was on her side. She hadn't backed down, and it had made a difference. Sarah walked over to Amara, her expression soft but determined. "You did it," she said, placing a hand on Amara's shoulder. "We did it." Amara nodded, her throat tight. She was overwhelmed by the turn of events, but also grateful. Grateful that, with the right support, things had taken the right course. It wasn't over yet, but it was a victory in itself. Amara stood in the same spot where everything had begun, her eyes following the police car that had driven off with the officer in the back. The officer who had pulled her out of her car, treated her like a criminal, and escalated the situation unnecessarily, was now being taken away, arrested for his actions. It felt surreal. The tension that had filled her chest for hours was finally starting to fade, replaced with a sense of relief. The crowd had begun to disperse slowly, their faces still filled with disbelief at what they had just witnessed. Some had stopped recording, others were talking to each other, but they had all seen what had happened, and they had all supported her. Amara couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude for the people who had spoken up, for the witnesses who had seen the truth and made sure the officer couldn't hide what he had done. Sarah walked up to her, a quiet smile on her face. "You did great," she said softly. "You stayed calm, and you didn't let him intimidate you. You got through it." Amara nodded, still trying to process everything. I didn't know what was going to happen. I didn't expect it to go this far. It rarely does, Sarah replied. But that's the power of standing up for yourself. When you speak out, others listen. And they make sure things change. Amara glanced at the empty street, where just a few minutes ago, the first officer had been standing with all his authority, trying to control the situation. Now he was the one being questioned. It felt almost like a dream. As they stood there, Sarah's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and then turned to Amara. It's the district attorney's office. They want to talk about the next steps. Amara's heart skipped. She knew that what happened today was just the beginning. The officer's arrest wasn't the end of the story. It was just the first step toward holding him accountable for his actions. And she wasn't about to let it stop here. Sarah dialed the number on her phone, speaking briefly before handing it to Amara. They want to speak with you. Taking a deep breath, Amara accepted the phone. She had a lot to say, but she didn't know where to start. The past hours had been a whirlwind, and now that things were starting to settle, she realized how much she had learned about herself in the process. "Hello," she said, her voice steady but still a little shaky. "This is Assistant District Attorney Carter." A calm voice responded. "We've reviewed the footage from today, and we're moving forward with a full investigation. We'll be contacting you shortly for further statements. The officer in question has been arrested, and we're making sure this goes through the proper legal channels." Amara's mind raced. It wasn't just about her anymore. This was about making sure that what happened to her didn't happen to anyone else. She had become part of something much bigger than herself. "Thank you," Amara replied, her voice firm now. "I'll cooperate fully. I want to make sure this never happens again." There was a brief pause on the line before Assistant District Attorney Carter responded. "We're going to make sure justice is served. We'll be in touch soon." As Amara hung up the phone, Sarah gave her a knowing look. "This isn't over yet, but you're on the right side of things. We'll make sure the truth is heard, and that officer will face the consequences of his actions." Amara nodded. She was tired, yes, but she was also proud. Proud of herself for standing up. Proud of the support she had received from those who witnessed the truth. And most of all, proud that justice was beginning to take its course. As they began to walk toward Sarah's car, Amara took one last look at the street. Today had been a day she would never forget. It had started with fear, confusion, and anger, but it was ending with a feeling of hope. The battle for justice wasn't over, but it had been won today. And that was enough for now. The next few days were a blur for Amara. The arrest of the officer had made headlines, and the story of what had happened to her spread across social media. People who had witnessed the scene were sharing their accounts, and the video footage of the officer dragging her out of the car was being viewed by thousands. While it felt strange to be the center of attention, Amara knew it was necessary. It wasn't just about her. It was about shining a light on what had happened and making sure it never happened again. She had spent hours talking to lawyers, speaking to the district attorney's office, and reviewing the footage with Sarah. It was all part of the process, and while it was exhausting, Amara was determined to see it through. But even with everything moving forward, there was a part of her that still felt uneasy. She knew that the officer would face consequences for his actions, but what about the bigger picture? What about the many others who had experienced similar mistreatment? What was being done to change the system so that this kind of thing didn't happen again? As Amara sat at her kitchen table one morning, sipping her coffee and reading through her emails, she received a message from one of the witnesses who had recorded the video. His name was Marcus, and he had been the one to call up to the officer and ask why she was being treated so badly. "Hi Amara," the email began. "I just wanted to reach out and let you know that I'm really proud of you for standing up to that officer. You showed incredible strength, and I'm glad I was able to witness it. I've been thinking a lot about what happened, and I think we all need to do more to make sure this kind of thing doesn't keep happening. If you're planning to speak out, I'd like to help in any way I can. I want to be part of the change." Amara smiled as she read the message. It felt good to know that Marcus was on her side, and that the witnesses weren't just passive observers. They were willing to take a stand and help make a difference. A few days later, Amara received an invitation to speak at a community event about her experience. The event would focus on police accountability and how the community could work together to bring about real change. At first, Amara hesitated. She wasn't sure she was ready to speak publicly about everything that had happened, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized it was an opportunity to make her voice heard. She called Sarah to discuss the invitation, and Sarah encouraged her to take the opportunity. "This is bigger than you, Amara. This is about making sure people understand that no one should have to face what you did. You're in a position to help create change. You can't let fear stop you." With Sarah's encouragement, Amara decided to speak at the event. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she also knew it was necessary. She had to keep fighting, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been mistreated or overlooked. The day of the event, Amara stood before a crowd of people in a community center, the room buzzing with anticipation. As she took the microphone, she felt a wave of nerves rush over her, but she pushed through. She had a story to tell, and she wasn't going to let fear hold her back. When she spoke, her voice was strong and clear. She told her story, the fear, the confusion, the anger. But she also spoke about hope and change. She spoke about the power of standing up and the importance of supporting each other. She spoke about the need for a justice system that protected everyone, no matter their background. As Amara finished her speech, the crowd erupted into applause. She felt a sense of pride and accomplishment, knowing that her voice had been heard. The road ahead was still long, but she was ready to face it. She had stood up for herself, and now she was ready to help make the world a better place for others.